All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive back in time today. We're headed to the Maritime Provinces of Canada, using this incredible travel handbook from the 1890s as our guide.
Ooh, I do love a good historical travel guide. So who is this handbook written for back then? What kind of traveler?
Imagine like the original Lonely Planet, you know?
Yeah.
But instead of backpackers on a shoestring budget, picture steamships and those old-timey
The
hats.
top hats, yeah. And what I find fascinating is this handbook was structured like a Baedeker, which were those super popular European travel guides, very compact.
Right. Efficiency was key. You couldn't just like scroll through endless travel blogs back then.
Exactly. This thing had to fit in your coat pocket right next to your, well, maybe your monocle if you were fancy.
Alongside the opera glasses. But the best part, this editor, he was obsessed with accuracy. Like, he actually traveled extensively to personally verify every single detail.
Wow, talk about dedication. That's months on the road, probably bumping along those same routes himself just to ensure everything was up to snuff.
No Google Maps to rely on. All right, so let's hit the, well, not the road, the high seas. Steamships, that was the way to travel long distances back then.
Right, absolutely. The pinnacle of technology at the time, though.
The what? Don't leave me hanging. Were they at least, like, serving cocktails on deck? A little 1890s mixology.
Not quite the luxury cruise experience you might be picturing. Think more cramped quarters, the constant thrum of the engines. But hey, it was a marvel for its time.
I bet. Okay, so get this. The handbook actually lists the steamship routes, right? A&D, the costs. A round trip from Boston to Halifax was only $15.50.
Can you imagine?
I spend more than that on avocado toast in a week.
It's incredible, isn't it? It really highlights how travel back then was a luxury, expensive and time consuming. Not for everyone.
For sure. So speaking of luxury, or maybe lack thereof, let's talk about where these intrepid explorers rested their weary heads after a long journey. The hotels.
Oh, yes, the accommodations. Let's just say expectations were a tad different back then.
A tad. This handbook straight up warns readers about less than ideal lodgings in certain areas.
They really don't sugarcoat it, which makes you wonder.
Right. Like, what exactly were they dealing with?
I shudder to think.
Okay, but hold on. Say steamships weren't your thing.
Yeah.
What were the alternatives? Were we talking, like, donkey-powered carriages?
Well, trains were becoming increasingly common. Faster, but maybe not always more comfortable.
Wait, faster? How rough were these trains?
Well, let's put it this way. The handbook mentions second-class travel as very uncomfortable.
Eating
Cramped compartments, soot from the engine blowing in through the windows.
and probably no Wi-Fi. I can see why steamships with that fresh sea air, maybe slightly less questionable food, remained a popular choice. But if the hotels were so hit or miss, that had to impact tourism overall, right?
Absolutely. Imagine planning a trip knowing that finding decent accommodations was going to be, well, a challenge.
Makes you appreciate just how easy we have it these days.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, there's a certain romance to it, you know? That ruggedness, the spirit of adventure. This handbook is like a window into a world that's both familiar and strikingly different from our own. You know, flipping through this handbook, what really grabs me are the stories. You know, it's not just like turn left at the old oak tree. It's more like beware of the ghosts of shipwrecked sailors.
Right. Those little details really bring the past to life.
Totally. Like this, the Algonquin Hotel. It's in St. Andrews. They still have it today, but can you imagine it back then?
Oh, absolutely. Perched on that hill overlooking the bay, a grand old place in a bustling port town, you can practically hear the clang of the shipyards, smell the salt air. Probably mixed with a few other things back then.
Yeah, probably not the luxury spa experience it is today. Okay, but this handbook also mentions something, well, a bit darker. The shipwreck at Eelbrook Cove. That's on Grand Manan Island.
Oh, yes. The Lord Ashburton. Tragic story, that one.
Why have it?
Ran aground on the rocks there in the cove. The handbook says most of the people on board, they didn't make it. It's a stark reminder, really, of just how dangerous the sea could be.
Wow, makes you think. Speaking of, well, maybe not chills, but this handbook describes Campobello Island as having, and I quote, insular and provincial quaintnesses.
Quaintnesses?
Yeah, it sounds charming, I guess. But then it mentions an ultra-Anglican Episcopal church.
Ultra-Anglican.
Yeah, like what does that even mean?
Well, it suggests a community very much rooted in tradition, even more so than other parts of the mainland. You have to imagine elaborate services, formal sermons, a world apart, even then.
Like a little slice of England dropped right onto an island in Canada. Okay, so from islands to rivers now. This handbook's description of the St. John River. Wild.
Oh, it was the height of the lumber boom. The St. John was like its lifeblood.
It describes it as a highway of logs.
It practically was. Imagine timber rafts as far as the eye could see, sawmills lining the banks, working day and night.
It's hard to picture now. So for those of us who only know lumber from, like, Home Depot, how big of a deal was this lumber boom?
It was huge. The demand for timber was insatiable, building houses, ships, you name it. And the Maritimes, with all those forests, they were in the perfect position to meet that demand.
Wow. Okay, so we've had shipwrecks, ultra-Anglicans, a whole lot of lumber, but this deep dive wouldn't be complete without a little conflict, right? The handbook mentions a Micmac Indian attack on a British war vessel.
Ah, yes. This would have been in 1759. A British ship entered Miramichi Bay looking for supplies.
Okay.
A landing party went ashore, and they were ambushed, killed. The British retaliated, of course, and quite brutally. They destroyed the nearby town of Canadian Cove.
A reminder that this region, it wasn't all, quaint harbors and charming inns.
Indeed, there were darker chapters, for sure.
And speaking of dark chapters, this last story in this section of the handbook, it's heartbreaking. 20 Breton fishing vessels lost in a single night off the coast of Cheticamp.
A terrible storm. The kind that, well, those who made their living on the sea, they knew the risks, but
20 vessels gone, just like that.
the handbook describes the devastation. The ships dashed against the rocks. Entire families lost.
The sea, it gives and it takes away. It's hard to even fathom the grief in that community. What were the chances of surviving a storm like that back then, really?
Not good, to be honest.
Mm.
Ships weren't as resilient. Weather forecasting was, shall we say, rudimentary at best. And navigational tools, nothing like what we have today. Once a storm hit, well, it often came down to luck, plain and simple. And the skill of your captain.
It really makes you think, the Maritimes, this place of incredible beauty, but also, like you said, you can't escape that element of risk.
It's always there, especially the sea demanding respect. And for the people who lived and worked on the water, well, that awareness of danger, it was just a part of life.
Which makes it even more amazing when you think about the communities they built, the industries that thrived.
Resilience, that's the word that comes to mind. Even with all the talk of shipwrecks and, let's face it, questionable accommodations, you still get this sense of, I don't know, optimism from this handbook.
It's true. Like, it doesn't shy away from the hard stuff, but there's this underlying, like, we're here for it kind of attitude.
Exactly. Like that old saying, we're not here for a long time, we're here for a good time. They found ways to enjoy themselves, to build those connections, to make a life in this, well, pretty remarkable part of the world.
Speaking of making a life, there's this idea in the handbook, kind of a what-if moment. If it had actually happened, it would have completely changed the map of Canada.
You're talking about uniting the Maritime Provinces.
Right, merging them all into one big province, Acadia.
Acadia. It's a fascinating thought experiment.
One giant maritime powerhouse instead of 3 separate provinces. How do you think that would have changed things?
Who knows? Would they have had more political clout? Would their economies have developed differently? It really makes you think.
History, right. It's full of these little sliding door moments. Things could have gone in a totally different direction.
And it's a reminder that so much of it comes down to choices, doesn't it? The choices people make. Or sometimes the choices that are made for them.
Like a devastating storm or a treacherous stretch of coastline.
Exactly.
I have to say, this deep dive, it's really been eye-opening. You read about history, but this handbook, it just brings it all to life in a way I never expected.
It's those individual stories, you see, all those threads that create the bigger picture.
And by understanding those stories, by really connecting with the past, I think it helps us understand where we are today a little bit better.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So to everyone listening, next time you've got a free afternoon, maybe feeling a little adventurous, I highly recommend digging into the history of the Maritimes. You never know what you might discover.